a political movement, not creativity, not invention, not free minds, not political liberty, but a political movement. A political movement, presumably based on majority rule, based on the will of the people, imposing their ideas, their desire for unearned wealth on those who actually produce it. The Industrial Revolution of the 19th and 18th century. All of these were made possible. They were huge achievements, massive spikes in prosperity throughout the world, particularly in the Western world. Hello again, and welcome to the Moneyball Method podcast. My name is Mark Shupe. I am the author of the book, The Moneyball Method, a Middle-Class Manifesto for Objective Investing. And I'd like to continue our conversation about the book titled Abundance, written by Ezra, Klein, and Thompson. In particular, today, I'm going to cover a little bit from chapters 4 and chapter 5, and I'm going to read a few quotes from each of those and respond to those using the principles and the process of the Moneyball Method. Chapter 4 is titled Invent. Now, that's an interesting title for a chapter in a book by people who don't know anything about the process of invention. Invention requires creativity. It requires long-term mental focus and thought. Invention is only something that occurs in an environment of freedom, the ability to think independently, and yet there's nothing in the book about that. But there's an interesting quote in the book that says modern liberal politics is made possible by invention. What do they mean by modern liberal politics? I would argue that it should read postmodern liberal politics. Classical liberalism is all about tolerance and liberty and freedom. Postmodernism is anti-reason and anti-liberty. But what does invention make possible about postmodern liberal politics? Well, it is precisely the wealth that is created by independent free minds who are creative, who have made the wonders of the world possible, the technological revolution of the 20th and 21st century, the industrial revolution of the 19th and 18th century. All of these were made possible. They were huge achievements, massive spikes in prosperity throughout the world, particularly in the Western world. That is what makes government possible. Government doesn't produce anything. Government is only able to operate by extracting wealth from the private sector. Government is consumption. Government is the destruction of wealth. And in many cases, that's necessary and good, particularly for the protection of rights and liberty and justice. But the wealth created by the inventors has made postmodern leviathan of government possible. The bureaucratic state, the regulatory state, the welfare state, whatever you want to call it, the authors are correct. Wealth-producing inventions have created the government leviathan and made it possible. Quote number 2, the most important idea that emerged from the Bush report was the primacy of basic research. Vannevar Bush was his name, was an author that was cited in the book as evidence of their philosophy and process. The primacy of basic research without thought of practical ends. In other words, scientific research for its own intrinsic value. That is dangerous. If we are engaged in scientific research for no specific purpose, specifically research that is funded by money extracted from the private sector, it can be used for destructive purposes. Subtitle of my book is A Middle-Class Manifesto for Objective Investing. Objectives are necessary. Objectives are essential in order to have scientific research, engineering, and inventions that serve human life and prosperity. Quote number 3, Bush saw the future of a size of a kind of hub and spoke system, with the federal government directing funds to the most deserving university researchers. The federal government directing funds. Whose funds? Where did it come from? How is wealth created? How did the government get hold of the funds to direct them in the first place? It can only happen through coercion. It can only happen through the force of taxation and regulation and the threat of prosecution if you do not comply. That is the nature of government. And directing it to the most deserving university research. Deserving by according to whom and by what standard? I would argue, as my book does, that market forces are a far better way to allocate wealth toward research and development than any centralized government planner could possibly accomplish. For evidence of that, think of the Soviet Union. Think of their 5-year plans. Think of the mass murder, starvation, and slavery that was the result of government directing funds that they had absconded from the rightful owners, those who created it. Quote number 4 from chapter 4, titled Invent. To make these things possible and useful in our lifetime requires a political movement that takes invention more seriously. A political movement, not creativity, not invention, not free minds, not political liberty, but a political movement. A political movement presumably based on majority rule, based on the will of the people, imposing their ideas, their desire for unearned wealth on those who actually produce it. Take invention more seriously. To take invention seriously requires that people have the freedom to act according to their own rational self-interest. That is economic power. Economic power is the power of the human mind to create, to invent, to manufacture, to distribute through voluntary transactions for mutual profit of all parties, free of coercion. That is the nature of economic power. And what the authors are doing here is conflating that with political power. And that is precisely the problem that we are faced with in a decivilizing culture today, and the problem that is being advocated by this book, conflating political power with economic power. They're not taking invention seriously at all. It is impossible for government bureaucrats to have the inventive, creative results that only capitalism can provide. Quote number 5, government-funded research and development has been responsible for 25% of productivity growth in the United States since the end of World War II. That may be true, but what about the productivity growth that did not occur? The productivity growth that cannot be measured because it was never invented, it was never engineered, it was never manufactured, it was never distributed. Capital flows to talent. Talent obeys reality. How much capital did not flow to talent in order to fund the government programs that the authors are bragging about in this book? Again, they are conflating political power with economic power. And how do they get away with it? Because we live in a culture that has demonized money. We live in a culture that, or a society where the government is debasing the currency. Every one of these 5 quotes from chapter 4 require vast sums of money without any regard to the virtues that produce the money in the first place, ignoring the fact that money in circulation is the legacy of productive human minds. Once we lose respect for the virtues that are behind the money that is in circulation, we end up with ideas like this. I'd like to move to chapter 5 of the book by Klein and Thompson. It is titled Deploy. Deploy what? the inventions from chapter 4 that are impossible to create except through the force of government that largely wastes the capital that they confiscate in the first place? At any rate, let's go to a few of the quotes from chapter 4. In a parallel universe where we had continued to develop and deploy solar, we might today have the green energy paradise of our dreams. Yes, they said that. An economy fully fueled by the sun. In other words, a very diffuse form of energy, one that requires millions upon millions of square miles of solar arrays all over the planet, linked by high power transmission lines that do not exist, would be horribly expensive to create and would wreck the environment. This is what this book is about, a parallel universe, a green energy paradise. And who do they blame for the fact that we are living in the conditions that we are today? President Ronald Reagan. According to the authors, he is the one that stopped the funding of solar projects in the mid-1980s. Let's get to quote number 2. It is a vision of a new kind of entrepreneurial state. It is the government of bottleneck detective. Entrepreneurial state. An impossibility, a contradiction in terms. Entrepreneurship requires economic power from creative minds in a culture of political liberty. The state is force. The statement is so absurd that I'm not going to continue. Number 3, this policy is called Advance Market Commitment, or AMC. And AMC is particularly effective when the world needs an abundance of brand new technology that is currently too expensive. The world needs, according to whom? There is no such thing as a collective mind. There are millions of different communities throughout the world with different needs, different cultures, different resources, different stages of development. What they are looking for is a utopian paradise of total equality, the desire for the unearned for the benefit of the common good, which does not exist. An abundance of brand new technology. According to whom? Who's going to create it? How will it get funded? How will it get manufactured? How will it get distributed? All of these require a free market system dependent upon the price discovery mechanism that is only possible by the millions of participants in that free market system who have the most information about their facts and circumstances on the ground. Currently too expensive. If you would look at the cost of medical services, the cost of higher education, the cost of anything that is heavily regulated by the government in the first place, those are the things that are too expensive because of third-party payers, because of the lack of a efficient market system, because of the abuse of the price mechanism. If chapter 4 of this book abuses the reputation and integrity of money, chapter 5 of this book abuses the reputation and integrity of the price mechanism. Quote number 4, building, deployment, and implementation are not the stuff of happy breezes. They require deliberate acts, laws, and policies. In other words, totalitarian government. No, that is not the stuff of happy breezes, but that is precisely what Klein and Thompson are advocating in their destruction of money, their abuse of the price mechanism, and their conflation of economic power and political power. To wrap up my conversation today, I'd like to quote Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek. He published a paper, the most widely read white paper in economic history, and he published that in 1945. He says, the knowledge of circumstances of which we must make use never exists in concentrated or integrated form, but solely as the dispersed bits of incomplete and frequently contradictory knowledge which all the separate individuals possess. Individualism, political liberty, economic freedom. That results in the voluntary transactions and mutual profit embodied in economic power. Finally, Hayek says, the economic calculus proper helps us, at least by analogy, to see how this problem can be solved, and in fact is being solved by the price system. And with that, I would like to conclude, and I will wrap up my conversation about the book titled Abundance in next week's podcast. Thank you for tuning in.